2. Have you ever wondered how we started using paper? Like when, and why, and how? Well, in this episode, I'm going to tell you all about it. Paper has been around for thousands of years. And when people first started using it, it was very different than the kind of paper that we use today. The earliest paper-like substance that we know of comes from 18,000 years ago in what is now China. Back then, people were writing on pieces of cloth, but eventually they started using more easily accessible materials like wood, bamboo, and hemp. To make their writing surfaces, they would take these materials, beat them into a pulp, spread that pulp out into sheets, and then dry them up in the sun. This type of paper was so popular that it stayed in use for over 1,000 years. But around the year 100, people started using a new material, papyrus. Papyrus was made from the papyrus plant, which grew along the Nile River in Egypt. The plant's stems had a spongy texture that could be used for writing, so people would slice the stems into thin strips, lay them down side by side, and then press them together with a mallet. Once the strips were flattened, they were left to dry. And that's how they made their paper. Papyrus was cheaper to produce than cloth, but it also wasn't as durable. Still, it was a huge step forward and helped to preserve ancient Egyptian knowledge. It also inspired the development of the first paper mill in the world. But despite these innovations, paper was still pretty hard to come by. That didn't change until 1798, when an English inventor named John Gamble invented the first paper machine. His invention allowed paper to be produced quickly and cheaply. So finally, paper became something that everyone could use. The way we make paper hasn't changed much since the Industrial Revolution. We still start with a pulp, spread that pulp out onto a screen, and then dry it up. The difference is now, we have machines that do all that work for us. But where does that pulp even come from? Well, paper can be made from just about anything that's fibrous. Tick. It can come from plants like cotton or flax or hemp, or it can come from animals like leather and bone. But by far the most common source of paper is wood. The paper industry uses more than half of all wood products worldwide, which makes up about 20% of all solid waste. In other words, every year the paper industry uses up a ton of trees. But don't worry, because they don't just throw those trees away. They turn them into paper, obviously. But seriously, there is a whole process behind turning logs into letters. Let's break it down. Paper making starts with the trees. Paper companies buy wood from local lumber yards, then bring it to their factories. At the factory, the logs are put into a machine called a debarker. This machine removes the outer layer of the tree's bark, which is too tough to be used for paper. Then the logs are washed to remove any dirt or other debris. Next, they go through a machine called a strander. This machine cuts the logs into long, thin strands. Those strands are then fed into a machine called a hydropulper. This machine mixes the strands with hot water and chemicals to break them down into individual fibers. The result is a thick, soupy liquid called pulp. That's where the term pulpy gets its meaning. Once the pulp is ready, it goes through a series of machines that wash and screen it to remove any impurities. Then, it goes through a machine called a head buck. This machine mixes the pulp with water and other chemicals. That will help the paper dry and be as white as possible. From there, the pulp goes onto a machine called a Ferdrinier wire. This machine spreads the pulp out into a thin sheet. As the sheet comes off the machine, it goes through a series of rollers that squeeze out any excess water. Then, it goes through a series of dryers that use hot air to remove any remaining moisture. The result is a continuous roll of paper. This roll is then cut into individual sheets and packaged for distribution. But making paper isn't just about turning wood into sheets. There's a lot of science that goes into making sure that the paper is strong, smooth, and the right size. For example, the length of the wood fibers affects the strength of the paper. If the fibers are too short, the paper will be weak and tear easily. So, paper makers have developed a test called the Canadian Standard Freeness Test, or the CSF test, to measure the length of the fibers in a given pulp. The longer the fibers, the lower the number. And paper makers use this test to make sure that the fibers are the right length for the job. There are also machines that measure the width of the paper as it comes off the Ferdrinier wire. If the paper is too wide, it'll be trimmed. And there are also machines that measure the thickness of the paper. If the paper is too thick, it'll be thinned out. But probably the most important part of the paper-making process is the sizing. Paper is sized to control its porosity. Porosity refers to the number of voids or holes in a given area of paper. The higher the porosity, the more absorbent the paper is. Papermakers use this property of paper to their advantage. For example, they might use unsized paper to make towels because they want the paper to be as absorbent as possible. Or they might use sized paper to make magazine pages because they do and want ink bleeding through the page. So there you have it. That's how we make paper. It's a long and complicated process, but the end result is worth it. Literally hundreds of millions of tons of paper are produced each year, and it's all thanks to a combination of cutting-edge technology and good old-fashioned craftsmanship. In the past, paper was expensive and hard to come by. Only the wealthy elite could afford to buy it, but now it's cheap and easy to get. We use it for everything from writing to printing to packaging, and we take it for granted. But next time you pick up a piece of paper, take a moment to appreciate all the hard work that went into making it. But before you go and start hoarding paper, let me just say one thing. Recycling paper saves trees, water, and energy. So please recycle your paper whenever you can. Okay, now it's time for a quick recap. What is paper? Well, paper is a thin, flat material that's made from fibrous plant matter. It's used for writing, printing, and packaging. How is paper made? Well, paper is made by taking raw materials like wood or cotton and turning them into a pulp. The pulp is then spread out into a thin sheet and dried. What is the history of paper? Well, paper has been around for thousands of years. It was first invented in China and then spread to other parts of the world. Today, paper is made from wood. But in the past, it was made from other materials like linen and hemp. Alright, class dismissed. Now go out there and make some paper, or recycle some paper or something. Alright, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.